Welcome to our fourth broadcast of Ferment TV. I'm Kim McDonald, and I lead special projects at Ginkgo Bioworks. I'm the creator of Ginkgo Ferment and the project director of Ferment TV. For those new to Ferment TV, we're an experimental space for virtual gatherings by Ginkgo Bioworks in partnership with London-based agency Faber Futures. We're featuring multimedia storytelling from the world of synthetic biology. We're foregrounding emerging ideas from some of the world's leading scientists, designers, industry leaders, artists, and thinkers at the intersection of biology, technology, and society. You can visit ferment.tv to learn more about what we're up to and see past conversations. Speaking of things that the Ginkgo creative team is up to, I also wanted to take some time to shout out the launch of Grow by Ginkgo. Grow is a magazine about synthetic biology that seeks to tell authentic, vulnerable, and creative stories that reflect our wonder for biology and our respect for its natural processes and our humble optimism to collaborate and interact with it. Grow's artistic director and editor, Grace Chuang, and the editorial team just celebrated a huge new digital platform launch yesterday with new articles featuring diaries from the pandemic, the extinction of the banana, and lonely woolly mammoths, as well as pieces from the past print issue. Head over to growbyginkgo.com to start reading, and then follow them on Twitter and Instagram at growbyginkgo. Now, per usual, before we get going with our conversation today, I have a few housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded so that we can share it online afterward. We're looking forward to your questions, so please share them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll explore them together in the last 15 minutes of this session. Finally, stick around until the end, where I'll return to preview next week's broadcast. And for today's, we're featuring the theme of living, prioritizing health, education, and well-being for resilient communities. I'm very excited to welcome our speakers, Dr. Alondra Nelson and Dr. Joan Donovan, in conversation with Christina Agapakis. They're addressing how racism is a serious public health issue, as well as the socio-political dimensions of pandemics. Dr. Alondra Nelson, president of the Social Science Research Council and Harold F. Linder Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, is an acclaimed researcher and author who explores questions of science, technology, and social inequality. Nelson's books include Body and Soul, The Black Panther Party and the Fight Against Medical Discrimination, and The Social Life of DNA, Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation After the Genome. He's co-editor of Genetics in the Unsettled Past, The Collision of DNA, Race, and History, and Technicolor, Race, Technology, and Everyday Life. Nelson serves on the Board of Trustees of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and on the Board of Directors of the Teagle Foundation and the Data and Society Research Institute. She's an elected fellow of the American Academy of Political Science, or Political and Social Science, and of the Housekeeping Center, and is an elected member of the Sociological Research Association, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. Dr. Joan Donovan is the research director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. Dr. Donovan leads the field in examining internet and technology studies, online extremism, media manipulation, and disinformation campaign. Dr. Donovan leads the Technology and Social Change Project, TASK. TASK explores how media manipulation is a means to control public conversation, derail democracy, and disrupt society. TASK conducts research, develops methods, and facilitates workshops for journalists, policymakers, technologists, and civil society organizations on how to detect, document, and debunk media manipulation campaigns. Dr. Donovan's research can be found in the academic peer-reviewed journals such as Social Media and Society, Journal of Contemporary Ethnography, Information, Communication, and Society, Social Studies of Science, and Online Information Review. Her contributions can also be found in the books Data Science Landscape Towards Research Standards and Protocol, and Unlike Us Reader, Social Media Monopolies and Their Alternatives. Dr. Donovan's research and expertise has been showcased in a wide array of media outlets, including NPR, Washington Post, the New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Atlantic, and more. and today's moderator and birthday girl, Christina Agapakis.
Happy birthday!
Thank you.
Christina.
So this is a great birthday present for me. It is such a joy and pleasure and honor to be able to talk to you both today. I'm a huge fan of both of your work. For a long time, you've been a real inspiration to me and to so many. So thank you for being here, and I'm really excited for this conversation. I think what's both of you study science and technology in society, right? And I think what's so fascinating to see from your work is that both of you show us ways that these things that we think of as sort of abstractly technological or somewhat sort of like outside of society are actually so obviously deeply intertwined with social and political issues. And so there's I think an interesting thread that kind of connects a lot of your work where you kind of show that these things, these platforms or technologies that we think of as somehow not social or even worse, like equalizers, are actually have these kinds of social implications kind of underlying them that challenge that assumption. So for example, things like genetic testing and DNA science genetics, we kind of think of it as something that might be like equalizing all of us, showing us how we're all connected. And both of you have really interesting research that really pulls apart the social dimension of that. The COVID-19 pandemic, early on, we were kind of heard things like, oh, this is gonna be a great equalizer. And we've seen that it's anything but. And then internet platforms and sort of the ways that the platforms that allowed us to communicate with each other also kind of had this kind of idealistic sort of equalizing ethos and dream, but it has many things have gotten in the way of that. So I thought that would be a kind of an interesting thread to kind of think about, like how does your work kind of show those social dimensions? And maybe we could start by looking at some of both of your work on genetic testing in very different communities, and how your work on sort of looking at the social dimensions, the people who are using genetic testing, how and why they're using that, and what that kind of says about the technology and the science of DNA and genetics. I don't know who should start.
You know, let's do, beauty first.
Dr. Donovan.
You know, Dr. Donovan. Yeah.
Come on, Dr. Donovan.
Bring the wisdom.
Okay.
It's intimidating, you know, to answer questions that big anyway. So
yeah, that is a big question.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And thanks, Christina, for having me. I won't speak for Dr. Donovan, and thanks to you and Nutsai for creating this space. I'm very curious, and I'll be interested to follow the conversations. We don't have enough kind of spaces, I think, at the intersection of conversation around the social and the biological. So, so what to say? I mean, I guess. What we know about genetics and genetic data is that what gives it meaning are society and culture and politics. I mean, it's true of any data, whether it's genetic data or other kinds of data. And I think one of the interesting things about following the early days of direct-to-consumer genetic testing, you know, as I did in the early aughts, was watching the companies try to create that meaning, you know, and try to and sort of have to test drive and sort of fail sometimes at sending information to consumers that made no sense to consumers. So certainly early on in the days of testing, you know, if you sent, you know, a consumer sheets and sheets of SNP markers or sheets and sheets of genetic markers, that didn't mean anything. And so the companies became much better at saying, you know, you have these markers, you can see them if you want or download them if you want, but we're going to tell you through this data visualization or this certificate of ancestry what this means. And so, you know, direct-to-consumer genetic testing is, I think, you know, as much art as science. And, you know, I think we could talk about the science of it. But it's also the case that it's a really wonderful place to sort of see how not just genetic science, all of science really is put into the social world and makes meaning, but it's also given meaning in that circulation. So I've been, I think, interested in my work and really tracing and understanding that. And I've been particularly interested in how that circulation, dissemination, ecology happens for communities of color, for Black communities in particular, who have been arguably, not arguably, the most damaged by, pernicious thinking about biology and genetics, by, racist thinking, scientific racism from, the 17th century to the present. And the particular both hurdles and courage of Black communities that try to find space for their health and well-being, space to be, biologists, scientists, and the like, given that history of scientific racism.
Yeah, and what I would add to that, my research in this arena focuses on a much different population, where we wanted to understand. I was working as a postdoc at UCLA with Aaron Panofsky and Chris Kelty on a project to try to understand how white people interpret genetic ancestry testing. But it's really hard to find white people who will admit to being white. Lots of white people will dodge the question. My family will go, but we're Irish, right? Or they'll immediately go into either a nationality or, but they're not going to talk about themselves as being white. And so what we decided to do then was to go into communities of people that are really proud of being white, right? And so we investigated white supremacist communities who were having discussions about genetic ancestry testing. Typically, when we think about boundary making around white supremacist worldviews, we think about the one drop rule or other ways of using ancestry and bureaucratic records and family trees to make sense of oneself. But as these tests became more and more available, you did see white supremacists try to incorporate them into some of their boundary making work. And Alondra's right to say that there's an arc to this science where they do, the marketers start to realize that nothing's really translating. People are like, what's a haplogroup? I don't even know what this means. What am I paying for? And so they switch to talking about, you're either European, Asian, or African, right? Where these were the three dominant categories that would come back. And as when we studied from 2004 to 2015, so about 11 years of data, on this particular white supremacist message board. And so you saw even the transition in the ways of talking about and making meaning out of genetic ancestry testing as the tests developed. And they were creating a kind of worldview of how genetics represent them. And at the same time, they were struggling with the fact that genetics as a science is really messy. The data is messy. There's lots of confusing and confounding results. And so they would get back these results that would say that they are not 100% European. There would be, different kinds of mishmashed results that came back. And immediately, instead of thinking, oh, well, maybe there's something different about me, or maybe this is true about me, they would start to unravel the science. They would get really deep into genetic theories. They would start to then make up conspiracy theories about the companies that were giving these tests, saying that they were somehow part of some grand conspiracy to deracinate whites in the US in particular. And another thing that was interesting, though, is the data portability part of it that started to come up around 2012 and things, is they were able to take their data from one database and move it into another. And if the database didn't have a very rich population, a very diverse population set in it, they were effectively able to whiten up their data by moving it to smaller databases and then recalibrating how they felt about their results. And the conclusion of that research is essentially that there's many different ways of making up whiteness and of constructing your whiteness and of getting back to that. It's back to that point where you can somewhat trust the science if it's giving you the results that confirm what it is that you're seeking affirmation of. And Alondra's work was really informative, especially around this concept she came up with around genetic disorientation, which is that people don't often get results that are affirming, but they get results that do require them to do some introspection and do more research. And so the data portability thing, though, has been really interesting to think about in this moment, though, around research that's being done under our data bodies and other projects that are seeking to understand how these kinds of eugenicist frames are starting to show up in AI and starting to show up in other technologies that purport to describe the body in other terms and then render a vision of either what your history is or what your propensity to criminality is or what your facial expressions say about your emotions. And all of these things are very perplexing and disorienting for people. So I look forward to Dr. Nelson's next book on that topic.
We already have someone who wrote the book and dropped the mic, and that would be Ruha Benjamin. So we'll leave that there. True. But I would, you know, the other thing I would say about working on genetics, and it would be interesting to hear what Joan thinks about this, is that it is the best preparation for thinking about contemporary issues of data politics, because the stakes are very clear. I mean, Christina, when you introduced our conversation, you said, you know, that Joan and Joan's work kind of gets beyond the abstractions. And it's because the kind of racial politics of genetics are very clear, because it's a very old story of, you know, race making, racialization, and racism. And so I think to have that as a foundation, and then be a person who also wants to think and write about AI, wants to think and write about data surveillance, like, I think it's easier to understand how these things all exist there, even if the stakes are less visible than they would be in like a very, you know, kind of ham-fisted race-making tool like direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry testing that, you know, basically says this is your race. You know?
So much to think about. I think there's something. There is something really interesting in kind of like thinking about like, yeah, the kind of category making that genetics is doing, right? Like haplogroups, like in sort of like one way of doing it, like more sort of statistically that people are then having to kind of explain and then add these kinds of like cultural layers of meaning on top of. I think there has been, yeah, like there is, I think, an idea or a story that comes, I think, from the scientists often that, oh, like that feeling of disorientation, like that's going to show us that these categories like don't actually exist or are somehow like not actually meaningful. But it seems like, yeah, that kind of like identification of that or that first moment of disorientation is not enough. Like we have to kind of actually dig deeper to like the categorization itself, or there's something else kind of going on that we haven't been able to break out of because we kind of keep reinscribing those same categories. I don't know if that's a good way to think about it, but anyway.
Yeah, but I don't think we get out of that with technology. I think technology wants to promise us that there is a world beyond race that doesn't require a reckoning and a serious attempt at some kind of reparations, right? Because technology doesn't erase social inequalities, right? You may approach genetic ancestry testing as a way to say, oh, I want to know who I am, right? Or this like that at the molecular level, right? That it is written in the blood. But when you approach the world and you step into into the world with your body, people see you first. They don't see what's in your blood. And so there's lots of ways in which race is conceptualized and remade through all of our everyday interactions, right? But technologists often will try to remove the social, right? And try to crystallize around certain categories. And you can see it sometimes when you're even looking at the technologies where, we can, studying genetic ancestry testing from the perspective of white supremacists, they quickly move from European to white, right? But they don't understand or even recognize Jewish people as European, for instance. And so there's a lot of gradations that technology really has to write out in order to be prescriptive and understandable, right? And that is part of the marketing. That's part of the capitalist structure that we built around this. But when you think about genetics and you think about its possibility and capacity to help people with very rare medical diseases, then we're in a different kind of realm where the science focuses less on race, but more on, at the molecular level, unlocking like who you are and what your risks are. And then how we deal with that information, though, is at least in the U.S. situation is not, it's not good. You know, we don't give medical care to people that need it desperately, even when we know that there's ways in which we could prevent certain diseases from reoccurring by doing some simple genetic testing and follow-up. Which is to say that as we understand how technology creates abstractions around race, it also like reduces us very pragmatically to, you know, very few categories, which is, I think in some ways gives geneticists a really bad name, makes it harder for geneticists to even approach, you know, public intellectual life without being stuck in this mode of what the public understands about what genetics says about us.
I wanted to say one thing about, Christina, to your point about category making. I mean, I think the thing we have to remember is that it's not some like Habermasian table where we all sit down and make categories, right? I mean that, you know, we really have to understand that like we're all like equal partners in category making. Like science and technology are very powerful institutions, and that, you know, I can want to create all the categories that I can have lots of desire to create categories, but the imprimatur and power of science, of genetic science in this moment, of technology and of AI in this moment, to create categories, and then act as if in some instances the category making is not going on. You know, this is, you know, Joan is really laid out nicely the kind of black boxing of all of that work that happens before, I think, is how we get ourselves and, you know, the problem of not understanding how science and technology are always sort of political and social and indeed about political economy. I mean, all of these things all together at the same time. And that's, you know, I guess depending on the context and the situation, that's not necessarily good or bad. It just is as an empirical fact. And I think for me as a scholar, the challenge then becomes, how do we understand all of that, you know, that whole ecology around a particular science and technology and the way that people find it meaningful or not in the world.
You're both touching on something, right? Like this idea that, yes, well, obviously science is political, right? And is part of all of these complicated systems, but scientists like don't want to think that, or like we sort of can't or push it off, or right. I don't know, Joan, you're saying like about how, like the geneticist in public and this kind of public understanding of genetics pulls them in different directions and you have to kind of like compartmentalize in some ways, like the way that the scientists do that, right? So, and that opening up to the sort of implications of the social implications can be, are difficult for scientists. So I guess, and your work kind of like can help us see those connections. So I guess, yeah, like how can we help scientists, you know, how can we help scientists like see those and bring those kinds of perspectives in, or kind of acknowledge them rather than kind of like rejecting them or pushing them away?
Yeah, I think, you know, the work of a sociologist, to my mind, is to help translate knowledge into understanding about its broader impacts on society. And when I say society, I probably am just talking about like the stitching together of multiple different issue publics, right? I'm not trying to suggest that there's like a holistic culture here that we're like dealing with like a monolith. And in the way that sociologists approach this is we have one set of education, which is about sociology, and we learn frameworks, and we learn how to study science and technology. And then we go deep in a very specific subject matter area, and we want to learn as much as we can about that. So when I was carrying out my research, it wasn't just that I was at a university, I was in the Institute for Society and Genetics at UCLA with access to geneticists and other scientists who were struggling with these questions, right? And so our work was in conversation with scientists who are doing that kind of labor in the laboratory in a way. And science and technology studies has a very deep history of laboratories. Laboratory, and also trying to understand the process of science into a more public venue where people can understand that good science takes a really long time, and it's complicated, and it doesn't have all the answers. And so right now, I think, is an important moment for sociologists to step in and study science, technology, especially the datafication of biology in this moment, because that's going to tell us who we are for the next couple of decades, right? Because the data that we are developing right now in this very moment about COVID-19 is going to set the precedent for what the policy and the programs are going to be for planning around not just pandemics, but epidemics or other kinds of infectious disease outbreaks. And so we are in a crucial moment where sociologists must be engaging with technologists and scientists to understand what their questions are, what motivates their research, and how they get their answers, so that we can then create ways of doing public education, but then also of sort of lessening the burden of people who want to believe that scientists either have all of the answers or that the whole thing is total bullshit and is a conspiracy, right? Like, we need to move to the middle on this and start to understand science as it works.
Dr. Donovan, did you curse? Was that what happened there?
Oh, no, no. That was a glitch. Technology took over.
So I think to add to what Joan said, I mean, I would just say that all of us have an obligation as citizens, as humans in the world together, to, I think, question our orientation to the world, or what we think our orientation to the world is. And so it's not only scientists. I think there's a particular epistemology around science that makes it maybe easier, maybe more comfortable for scientists to say, it's got nothing to do with me. I don't know anything about that, even though my technology is now being used for predictive policing algorithms that, as was reported today, put somebody in jail, an innocent person in jail. But I think we all have in our different worlds kind of postures, choices that we make about how we want to, the standpoint we want to have on our work. And so we have in science for decades, an organization like Science for the People. More recently, we had the March for Science. We had a couple of 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago, shut down STEM. I think that there are people, people make choices about whether or not to be engaged in their work. They have, we have our colleague in sociology, Jonathan Metzl, and the anthropologist and MD Helena Hansen created a new curriculum for health professionals for, called structural competency, which is exactly, sort of educate yourself and have a different orientation, an enlightened orientation to the work, quite frankly, if we, want to sort of have another riff on kind of enlightenment ideals, like this is an enlightenment as well. So, I kind of want to refuse the sort of sense that it's only scientists, but I also want to sort of press on scientists not to actually be braver and sort of in their, and how they orient themselves to the rest of the world and to the implications of their work.
I love that. That's great. I wanted to pick up what you said about like making meaning from the data. With the pandemic, I think there's been like so much like conflict and tension around that data. Like, how are we making it? What does it mean? What does it mean for us? What is it kind of exposing or showing? How is that sort of being used by different groups to do different things? So I kind of wanted to, yeah, maybe kind of switch gears into kind of looking at like how are both of you looking at issues kind of that are coming through right now through the COVID-19 pandemic around all of these issues.
Did you want to go first, or?
Sure, I can. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
sure.
I think initially I thought, so I assume, Christina, well, I'm going to go to the racial ethnic disparities data around COVID-19 infection and mortality rates. And as someone who works in the fields that I work in, on the one hand, when I saw Representative Congresswoman Presley and others sort of saying we need the data, I thought, okay, great, like we do need the data. In part, we need the data because we have been seeing a level of such incompetence around just like basic public health and governance practices that like, let's just have some data because that's what a reasonable, responsible state can do. But I immediately also thought like, oh my gosh, we have the data. And because of the tautology of how we work with and name and, to your point, classify and categorize data, of course there were going to be racial health disparities. Racial health disparities are the context into which COVID-19 enters. It wasn't, COVID-19 didn't make racial health disparities. Like, we live in a world in the United States and the UK of profound inequality. And so there was this kind of tautology there, like, oh, COVID-19 created these disparities. What does it mean? When in fact, it was like, here comes this viral companion coming to spend time with us into a society that's rife with inequality from beginning to end. And so of course, that's going to be the outcome. So I was a little bit worried about the racial data. I mean, I think it's important that we have it. And I think it's much, it's more important that we have it than an alternative, like in a place like France, where it's clear that the rates are just disproportionately among refugee and immigrant populations, among communities of color, but there's a kind of holding off on aggregating any kind of data. So that said, like, what does that data mean? Like, what do the health disparities mean? What does it mean that African Americans have, depending on what data you're looking at, 2 to 2.5% higher rates of infection and mortality rates? What does it mean that you similarly see similar rates of disparity in the UK with what are called BAME, Black, Asian, minority ethnic populations, which are completely completely different from the Black and Latino populations in the United States, right? And so, I think a kind of easy, lazy read would be like, oh, it's got to be the genetics. So yes, of course, it's got to be the genetics of like every Black person in the US, everyone in the UK, people from the Asian subcontinent and the UK. I mean, like, it just doesn't even make any sense on the level of just like objective, clear thinking. But it's also the case that we already know why. And what I hope for out of this moment is, and what we're already seeing is, I think, more sophistication in the public sphere about racial health disparities and about the kind of edifice of medical discrimination, like all of the layers, right? So it's, we've got, discrimination in medical education. We have a history of mistrust coming out of experimental abuse. We have, in the literature, there's actually something called insurance discrimination, right? Because if you are, working class, a Black person in particular, having insurance, even if you have very good, I'm just not talking about like Medicaid or Medicare, if you have, good private insurance, does not ensure in the least that you receive the best care, good care, adequate care, right? Access to healthcare, access to insurance. So all of that, and then we've got, the social scientist, Arlene Geronimus has a concept called weathering, which is about the way that chronic experiences with racism and inequality literally weather the body down. So all of the kind of systems that you need to be healthy, endocrine, metabolism, your immune system, your cardiovascular system, those things that if they fail create the quote unquote comorbidities that we were talking about early on in the COVID crisis, are shown to be demonstrably weakened in people who face the chronic stress of chronic racism and a structurally racist society. Mm-hmm. So, let's take into account all of that. And it is, I use the word edifice kind of deliberately because it is this big thing and it's multi-layered, like some kind of sedimentary rock, like over time. And there's lots of different kind of layers and things that go into it. And so, that's the answer to why there are racial health disparities and ethnic health disparities, not only in the US, all over the world, and the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, so early on, we did I'm going to say this in a horrible Boston accent, but a webinar. I can't say the word right, and I'm really sorry. On, we invited in the ProPublica reporters that broke the story on the racial disparities and the data. And I think that part of the things, we have to actually think about the word statistics, which means science of the state, right? This is what the state is meant to do, is to ensure the health and security of the population by doing, massive amounts of survey work and trying to understand what are the true threats to population. And when data gets aggregated in certain ways and not others, we have to really question who's making those decisions. And is it a failure of resources? Is it purposeful obfuscation? Is it related to a history of erasure or gaps and silences? And as we were thinking about and talking about how to understand the data, we realized too that there's going to be this longitudinal data that we're going to have to reckon with, and we're going to have to do a lot of work to recover lost data. And we're going to have to do a lot of work to disaggregate data and to check all of this data that's coming out as we deal with this. And then while we were talking about it, though, we have a brilliant fellow, Brandy Collins-Dexter, who's at Color of Change, who put together a report that we're going to release tomorrow on COVID-19 misinformation that is targeting Black communities. And there were 4 persistent myths that had come up in the Black community that we wanted to make sure that people had knowledge of and were also equipped to address with correct information. So there was early on rumors that Black people could not die from COVID-19. So here's something where data matters because it challenges this myth that is circulating that at that time people were saying, do Black people even get COVID-19? Where are the Black celebrities with COVID-19, right? And then it became, celebrities did step into the fold and become spokespeople for the disease constituency. Another myth was that the virus was man-made for the purposes of population control, right? So this idea that the rising minority-majority population was such a threat to white hegemonic power structures that that there needed to be a bioweapon invented to decimate Black populations, right? And so this kind of myth is something that also circulates, but gets in the way of receiving timely, local, relevant information related to COVID-19, right? Because when you search for things like COVID-19, you find this as well as other information. The third myth was that the virus could not be contained the virus could be contained through the use of herbal remedies. And that too is something that speaks to the disparities in our health, our healthcare system, where a lot of people are treating major diseases at home, or are not treating, but triaging, right? Just trying to prolong their life, but at the expense of the quality. And they're doing this out of desperation in some respects. And also related to distrust in medical institutions. We cannot we cannot discount the fact that when you get mistreated by institutions, that kind of knowledge transfers not just within families, but intergenerationally. People will adopt the habits of their parents and bring them into their lives. Even when they, get a job that has health insurance, they might opt out. And then lastly was a more general misinformation rumor that was going around about 5G radiation as the root cause of COVID-19. And this was a pretty interesting bait and switch kind of misinformation rumor, which basically it was being championed by anti-vaccination advocates. And if you blame 5G and cell phone towers, then a vaccine makes no sense, right? That you wouldn't even go there to get a vaccine. So you don't actually have to fight the vaccine fight if you can convince everybody that 5G is the cause. And so these are the kinds of things that we've been documenting as a team, and that data is going to help us unpack and confront some of these some of this misinformation. But it's not the whole picture, and it won't be the whole picture.
So we got breaking news today. I can't wait to read this report, Joan. Sounds amazing.
I got the proofs. I got to do this sign off on the proofs so that, I'll do it at 3.
Okay. All right.
I'll get it done. And Brandy
I'll await my embargoed copy at 4.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I think, the issues that Joan, raises are, this is her world more than my world, but I think particularly with regards to African Americans, there's a scholar, Patricia Pat Turner, who wrote a book about sort of African American conspiracy theories probably 20 odd years ago. And one of the takeaways there was that there's always this grain of truth, right? The book's called Heard It Through the Grapevine. And, I'm looking at Joan's points here, sterilization in the population. Well, that is not just one historical fact. That has happened repeatedly in the history of the United States vis-a-vis African Americans, Puerto Ricans. There's been both chemical and surgical sterilization campaigns against poor working class and women of color again and again and again and again. So true. So not true in this case. Unfortunate if it means that people are not, using the sort of health-seeking behaviors we'd really want them to do, but totally understandable. Herbal remedies, if you don't have access to healthcare, if you don't trust healthcare, if you are actually just watching the news every evening, or however one watches the news, I'm showing my age here, watching the evening news, you see that you live in a society in which people are weighing the economy against lives. And often the equation is coming out for the economy. And so if you're having to you're seeing that, and then you're thinking about big pharma and pharmaceuticals, are you thinking, is this pharmaceutical because someone cares for me, my life, and my body? Or is this pharmaceutical for the kind of political economy of, American society? So I think that there are also kind of cost-benefit analyses that people are making, and, that what we use often in literature as distrust or mistrust with regards to these kinds of things, I know there are other, is I think not nuanced enough for all the things that are happening. So anyway, I just wanted to offer that, but I look forward to reading the report.
It's a banger. But it's really just the cassette single, because we got the full album coming out later this summer. Brandy's just been someone who's really taken a shine to understanding disinformation and understanding why we must study misinformation from a racialized perspective. And it's because of the way that misinformation tends to creep into communities is through vectors of identity, right? Where we've got sock puppet and fake accounts. We've got all these ways in which media manipulators will show up and impersonate Black people, trying to ride the legitimacy of their voices online, and in that cloaking, Jesse Daniels talks a lot about this. This goes back to early days of the web, cloaking your true intentions behind what technology really enables, which is the capacity to be anonymous and dangerous. You know, white supremacists were the first to register, I think it was Martin Luther King Jr.com, right? Jesse Daniels' early work really points this out. And if you were to search for that in, you know, Alta Vista or Yahoo back then, you would go to this site thinking you were going to get, you know, stuff for your history report on Martin Luther King, and you would get, you know, white supremacist propaganda. And so it's really important for us to, you know, understand misinformation as a targeted approach to creating immense polarization and wedge issues that really crowd out any kind of authentic voices or a capacity to represent oneself.
It sounds like, I think there's something that you're saying, which I think is really, I'd love to ask you about, like, I think that often, like so many of these issues that are like much bigger, like often we kind of like revert back to kind of like individual answers or solutions to these problems, right? So like, especially like, I mean, yeah, sort of like the science communication, social media world, there is a kind of like very kind of individualistic, like we got to get facts out there. Like you have to like learn how to interpret facts. Like it is a kind of like one-on-one sort of like battle against misinformation. I think a lot of your work is really showing like, yeah, you're talking about really systemic issues, right? Like these huge questions from history and trust and like long-term things and coordinated disinformation campaigns and platforms, right? What, I guess, the question is like, you know, what are the kinds of interventions that people like focus on and where should they be focusing? And maybe like, yeah, we're getting to the kind of Q&A time. One of the questions that's popped up from Stephen Hubbard asks about like this notion of transparency from institutions as a potential like intervention here too. Like he asks like, are there organizations doing a good job at radical transparency in pursuit of social good? I don't know, maybe the question is like, is that one of these kinds of interventions that you think could be effective, is effective, or what other kinds of things do we need to be thinking about?
I think that transparency alone, just like data alone, doesn't guarantee a social good outcome. And so that it's sort of transparency with values, you know, those things have to be, or, you know, transparency with the goal that one seeks, because otherwise it's just, you know, a bunch of data or a bunch of, you know, lots of information with no context, or lots of information that's not being led or guided by a sense of a social good that we're trying to reach. So, you know, it's like like the metaphor is kind of like you know, the old days of the Twitter API, there's just like a fire hose, like just a lot of stuff coming out, you know, and like that's transparency and that is awesome, but like you got to do something with that. And part of what you know, do with that is sort of say, what's the outcome that we're trying to accomplish? And I don't mean that in a like massage the data way, or, you know, like, you know, make things sort of ideologically massaged, but I just mean like, what is the good that we want? Do we want more people to be involved? Do we want more people to participate? Do we want more people to have a voice? You know, that's what I mean by values, not necessarily kind of people's polarized, to Joan's earlier point, ideological stakes.
Yeah, you know, when I think about transparency, let's take, for instance, something that we're all going through, which is the question of bots online. I don't give two about bots online, because if you can't show me where there's the impact, then it's just more talk, right? But what bots online are actually pretty good at is gaming algorithms, right? So it might be that bots talking to bots all day long, but what that does is send signals to the system that then sort of reorganize the information. And so when you query something, if a bot has been really pushing a particular kind of narrative and you query COVID-19, that's going to surface first because there's a lot of action. And manipulators really like when there's high attention and low content, because then they can close that gap really quickly. And so bots as a technology, right, are something that we need transparency on, just like we need transparency on how algorithms are surfacing and organizing information, right? That's one way to get there. But then, you know, then you start to get into these questions where all these lawyers are like, well, you know, do bots have a right to free speech? And I'm just like, don't ask me that question, because they're not people, right? They're programmed by people. And so, you know, when we get into transparency, the point of that story is to say that we actually have to localize it, and we have to point it at the problem, and we have to talk about what the transparency means and what the rubrics of interpretation are going to be. And then we have to set the policies and the ground rules so that it's consistent over time, so that people know what they are seeing when they see it. So does that mean bot accounts need to get, you know, a red check mark or something? Maybe it does, right? We fought pretty hard online over the past few years to figure out why and how certain information kept surfacing. And if, you know, we were running into roadblocks at platform companies. They were like, all this data is private, but if you're a marketing company, we'll sell it to you. Right. And then you go over here and you'd be like, but government, you should help us with transparency. And they'd be like, well, they're private companies, let them do what they want. Right. And then you go, you know, you try to snake your way in through the advertising system. And you're like, well, we need transparency in advertising because we've got these targeted ads and we don't know what they're saying. And they're actively causing political polarization. And then you get, well, you know, people are allowed to advertise, it's free speech. And so everywhere you go seeking transparency, you run into different forms of gatekeepers, different forms of opacity that are incredibly hard to knock down individually. They require a coalition. And it's not just research that's going to get us there. It's journalists, it's watchdog organizations, it's civil society. And like, if we can get a politician to pay attention, then it's politicians too. But at the end of the day, I think individuals who are interested in things like information literacy can do a lot with the networks that they have at their fingertips to make sure that people in their networks and in their nodes have access to information that they're seeking, and that information is accurate. And so when I think about what we need to do, we actually need to turn away from this reactionary content moderation mode where now Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg are like head content moderators in charge of the president's account, right? And move into a curation mode, move into a mode where we hire 10,000 librarians and we give them access to this data, and we have them help structure a taxonomy where when you Google something like, did the Holocaust happen? You get facts, you get things that are true and correct, because we have that right to truth. And so I think that those are the kinds of things that individuals can help position, can talk about, can surface, can demand of our information ecosystem. And at the same time, we also have to have a way to say no. And I think that this is something that Nazma Ahmed has really taught me, is that if our data is that valuable, we need a way to say no. And we need a way to say no to its transfer. We need a way to say no to its capture. And we certainly need a way to say no that involves deletion.
So we only have a couple minutes left, and I would love to hear from you. I think, you know, as things are starting to reopen, I think there's a lot of push and pressure to this kind of like, we want to return to normal, go back to normal. But I think so much of what we've seen in the past few months is that we shouldn't go back to normal, because normal doesn't work for people, right? Like normal has all these things that we don't want anymore. So I guess when you start to think about the after times, what are your hopes? What are your dreams? What do you want to see happening? What do you want us to learn from this moment?
Yeah, I think there is no, you know, first we're getting signs all over globally, locally, that we're probably making a mistake trying to reopen. I mean, like the data on the COVID rates is horrifying. And, you know, I don't know how we just bounce back into a new normal after 130,000 people have died in the United States. I mean, it really is, it almost defies apprehension. It's horrifying. Then the hopes. I mean, you know, one of the things that I was shocked by was, I said it a little bit before, that when the data about the COVID-19 rates first emerged, that almost simultaneously, there was all this good and smart thinking in the public sphere about the systemic racism in health and medical care. And that's, you know, an area that, you know, people like Evelyn Hammonds have been working in for decades. And to see in this moment of crisis that we had actually turned the corner and our kind of national understanding of racial health disparities was like stunning to me. And I think, I think also the kind of the affect and the experience of us, many of us having the luxury of being locked down, meant that we were all just sitting, watching the news, paying attention. And the news were middle-class people, sufficiently middle-class that they owned cars, lined up for miles at soup kitchens, right? And, you know, just the sort of poverty, the need, that is so pernicious in our society, and that was really sort of exacerbated by COVID-19. I think, and then the sort of protests around the extrajudicial killing, the lynching, indeed, of George Floyd, that is, you know, one instance of, you know, others. I think that this is a moment of true reckoning, actually. And so I'm not hopeful in the immediate future, because reckoning is hard work. Reckoning requires some people to give things up, some people, you know, and others to you know, take less. It requires that instead of having these kind of universal ideas about society and the great leveling and the great equality, that we actually understand that some people need more, and that we should give the more to people who are in need. So I think it's going to take us a while to get to something that feels like a space of hope, but I think we are certainly at a turning point in which things will be, I think, permanently different in some ways going forward.
Yeah, I'm happy to co-sign all of that and nail it to my wall, because I do think there's a difference between after and normal and like progress. And I use that word with like air quotes and double italics here, just to say that you know, there are moments like this, very rare in history, where all of the things collide. And we've got the pandemic, we've got these massive Black Lives Matter protests, and we've got an upcoming election where the integrity of the election is at stake, right? So the actual integrity of US democracy is at stake in this 2020 election. And unless we get some serious, and not the hand-waving kind of representational politics, but serious representational politics that have a political platform that is wedded to communities and community need, we don't get the reckoning we deserve, right? We get more of the same. And I think that you know, when we think about what's happened in the last 3 months or so, where the US was like, yeah, we can send trillions off to these giant corporations and everybody else can get $1,200, but here's all these carve-outs for the poorest of the poor who are going to get nothing. We have to realize that that's a political strategy too. And that is baked into the history of US racial politics, but also into our notion of equality and who deserves it and who doesn't. And so I am committed as an academic to helping with, you know, understanding these problems and moving us towards this moment of reckoning. But it's going to take a large multiracial coalition to get there. And I think it begins with people realizing and affirming their participation in this democracy and in, you know, the reckoning that is to come. And, you know, from my perspective, it's hard to, you know, individuals want action items that they can do themselves, but part of it is like just getting back to basics and connecting with people in your community and making sure that they have what they need. So a basic mutual aid structure is something that is like a good first step right now to make sure that the people within a few blocks of you have food, water, and shelter. And then, you know, you can branch out from there. And I've seen that happening all over the country, and it's really underreported, but extremely appreciated.
Well, we're out of time. I wish we could keep talking. It's been such a pleasure talking to you and so inspiring. Thank you so much for your time today and all your thoughts and your hard work. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Christina. Great to see you all.
Thank you. Good to see you. Thanks.
Bye.
And I'm back to quickly. Well, first I would like to thank Joan and Alondra and Christina for this wonderful conversation. I think that COVID-19 has surfaced so many issues that have existed for years that aren't new. And this conversation really highlights the importance of having these socio-political dialogues at the intersection of science. So thank you so much. And I'd also like to say a special thanks to Natsai Cheza, Laura Vent, Joanna Mann, Camille Thierry, Magda Almaco, and Marta Ubers. And then finally, as promised, a quick preview for next week's Ferment TV. Episode 5, Must We Revolutionize Nothing? Can we make our dreams come true? Dr. Alexandra Daisy Ginsburg is an artist working across nature, science, and technology, investigating the human impulse to better the world. And Dr. Drew Endy is a synthetic biologist and professor of bioengineering at Stanford University, president of the BioBricks Foundation, and co-founder of iGEM. Moderated by Christina Agapakis, they will explore the potential for more than human flourishing and how to challenge the structural limitations to the futures we want. Please visit Ferment TV to sign up for our newsletter and keep up to date with forthcoming broadcasts. Thank you for joining today and take care.